Welcome, everybody, to this Facebook Live session where we explore the intersection between Christianity and science. My name is Dr. Fuz Rana. I am the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at an organization called Reasons to Believe. If you want to know more about our organization, go to our website, www.reasons.org, and find out the resources that we have available to you as you seek to explore for yourself the relationship between Christianity and science. Today we're going to take on the question, what is the latest on interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals? This happens to be one of the most frequently asked questions I receive. Did Neanderthals and modern humans really interbreed? And if they did, what does that mean for the biblical account of human origins? What does that mean for the biblical perspective on human nature? Well, we're going to take on those questions and more in a few minutes, but before we do that, I'd love for you to do just a quick favor for me, if you don't mind. Please, whether you're watching this broadcast live or as a recording, go to the comment section and check in. Say hi. Let me know who you are and where you're watching from. This is valuable information for us to have as we plan future broadcasts, but also it's a great way for me to get to know you because I really want to know who you are. And I want to get to know who is it that's watching these broadcasts, and I want to know who is it that is interested in science-faith discussions, science-faith conversations. And by checking in, by saying hi, that's one of the best ways for me to get to know you. Also, take a moment and let me know what you think in the comment section about the question of modern human Neanderthal interbreeding. Whether you agree with me or not, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. I want to create a place on my Facebook page as well as on the YouTube channel that is hosting the recordings of these Facebook Live sessions. I want to create a space where we can have civil, constructive conversations about these very important topics. And then last but not least, suggest topics or pose questions for future broadcasts. I read every comment. I read every question. I may not have a chance to respond to everything, but I take what you have to say seriously. And I can tell you this, that what you say to me, your comments, your questions do indeed shape not only future broadcasts, but also shape the types of resources that I play a role in developing at Reasons to Believe. So thank you for your input, for your feedback. Now, let's go ahead and get started now with today's topic. Did modern humans and Neanderthals interbreed? And if they did, what does that mean for the Christian faith? Well, I'm using the publication of a preprint online at the Nature website as an excuse to talk about this frequently asked question. And this preprint was published by a team of researchers from Finland, from the University of Aarhus, I believe it's how it's pronounced, in collaboration with a team of researchers from the Max Planck Institute at Leipzig, Germany. This institute is one of the world's leading authorities on ancient DNA sequencing and analysis. And these two groups collaborated to survey a large number of Icelandic genomes for Neanderthal sequences. And from this work, they have found some interesting new insights into interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals. And we'll talk about what they did in just a minute. But before we do that, a little bit of background, I think, is important to help set the context for the work that they've done. It has now become, in effect, orthodoxy among physical anthropologists to conclude that modern humans interbred not only with Neanderthals, but also with these mysterious hominins called the Denisovans. And in fact, there's other evidence indicating that maybe modern humans also interbred with other hominins that currently are of mysterious identity, that are of unknown identity. In other words, it looks like interbreeding between modern humans and hominins actually has influenced the makeup, the compositional makeup of our genomes as human beings. And so the standard model is that as modern humans began to make our way out of Africa into Europe, or into the Middle East, and then into Asia and Europe, that we encountered Neanderthals and interbred with them. And then also we encountered Denisovans as humans made their way into Siberia and into Melanesia, and again interbred with Denisovans. And in both instances, these interbreeding events introduced hominin DNA into the human gene pool. On top of that, there's also some people that are now claiming that there's additional evidence for interbreeding between modern humans and hominins that, again, have an unknown identity, not only in Europe and Asia, but also maybe interbreeding events with hominins, again, of unknown identity when we were still in Africa. So this has now become, again, orthodoxy among physical anthropologists. A big question on the table was there one integration event, or were there multiple integration events throughout the course of human migrations? And today, most people are actually leaning towards there being multiple integration events, not a single event that took place. And again, these events would have shaped the compositional makeup of the genome of modern humans. Now, one thing that's interesting is that if you are of a non-African origin, if you are of Eurasian descent, you're part of the Eurasian population groups, you would most likely have about 2% Neanderthal DNA in your genome. But what we have learned is that while everybody has, again, of Eurasian descent, 2% Neanderthal genome in our genomes, that 2% is different from person to person. It's not the same Neanderthal DNA sequences. And this is part of the reason why people think that there were multiple integration events, not a single integration event that took place. And in fact, from these Neanderthal DNA sequences that are found in human genomes, you can reconstruct about 40% or so of the Neanderthal genome. That is remarkable. That is a remarkable find. That's a remarkable claim. And so in this particular study, with that background in place, these researchers were surveying genomes that are found in what's known as the DCODE database. And DCODE is a project that's taking place in Iceland where the objective is to sequence the entire the genomes for the entire Icelandic population. And right now they're about halfway through that. And so there's a huge number of Neanderthal genomes from which to analyze. And in this particular study, this research team took a look at about 27,500 modern human genomes using a new technique developed by a researcher at the University of Aarhus that was designed, again, to identify Neanderthal DNA sequences in human genomes. And so applying this technique to this sample of 27,500, which is the largest sample to date that's been surveyed for Neanderthal DNA, they discovered 14.4 million Neanderthal DNA sequences. And of those 14.4 million Neanderthal DNA sequences, about 112,000 of them were unique fragments. And from these fragments, they could construct almost 50% of the Neanderthal genome. Now, if you assume that there's 3.2 billion genetic letters in the Neanderthal genome, then it turns out that the genome size here, the size of these DNA fragments that were isolated or detected in the human genome are going to be about 575 base pairs in size on average. So these are fairly large pieces of DNA that are distributed throughout the human genome. Now, they concluded that it looks as if 6 distinct Neanderthal individuals actually contributed these DNA sequences into these Icelandic genomes, and that 84% of the fragments, as it turns out, come from Neanderthals, which is surprising because you would expect that it would be 100%. About 12% are of unknown identity, and about 3% are Denisovan fragments. And this was a bit of a shock because nobody expected Denisovan DNA to be in Icelandic genomes. This DNA should be, according to the models, found in either the genomes of people from the region of Siberia or Melanesia, not in European genomes. And so this indicates that maybe Denisovans were actually more geographically distributed than we thought, and they actually did have interbreeding or intergression events with Europeans as well as with people in Siberia as well as Melanesia. Or alternatively, it may indicate that humans and that Neanderthals and Denisovans were interbreeding, and that when the Neanderthals interbred with humans in Europe, that they already had some Denisovan DNA within their genomes. And so not only did they introduce their own DNA into our genomes through these intergression events, but also some Denisovan DNA as well. Now, what is that 12% unknown DNA? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure that the researchers know the answer to that either. Now, one other thing that they discovered in this work is that, unlike earlier studies that claimed that Neanderthal DNA introduced into the human genome had biological significance, that actually that DNA influenced the human phenotype, these researchers claim that the location of these DNA fragments is actually in regions of the genome where they would exert virtually no biological contribution to us. They would have no impact on our phenotype, that these were in effect neutral pieces of DNA that had little impact on our biology. So these are some really provocative, interesting new insights that this research team provided us. And they were able to provide these insights because they had a much more robust method to identify Neanderthal DNA in human genomes, and by virtue of the very large sample size that they were looking at and the population homogeneity of the sample size that they were looking at as well. So interesting stuff, to be certain. So then what should we do with these kind of studies if we are people that hold to a Christian worldview? What does this mean for our understanding of the biblical account of human origins and the biblical view of human nature? Well, before we unpack those broader questions, it might be helpful, again, to have a little bit more background. Now, Christians take a wide range of perspectives on who Neanderthals were and how they relate to humans. If you hold to a perspective known as theistic evolution or evolutionary creation, you would argue that Neanderthals and modern humans shared an evolutionary ancestor about 500,000, 600,000 years ago approximately, and that these two lineages diverged into populations that were isolated to the point that they probably were very close, if not were completely distinct species, and that the interbreeding essentially reflects the fact that we share a common evolutionary history. So theistic evolutionists would largely embrace the evolutionary view of Neanderthal identity and Neanderthals' relationship to modern humans. Some Christians argue that Neanderthals and modern humans were essentially the same species, that we really are the humans, both are the humans that are referred to in the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation accounts. And that they argue that evidence for this comes from the fact that we were able to interbreed, which means that we must have belonged to the same species. And they argue that Neanderthals had similar behavior capacity, identical cognitive abilities to modern humans. And therefore, they argue that Neanderthals were in effect us. I belong to a group of Christians that would take a view that Neanderthals and modern humans were distinct species, and that Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans, and that Neanderthals and modern humans, again, are fundamentally distinct or different creatures created by God, where Neanderthals were creatures that we could think about as being in the same vein as chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas. Fascinating creatures that were, again, cognitively and biologically distinct from modern humans. And that we take the view at Reasons to believe that modern humans would be essentially the humans that were being referred to in the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation account. But instead of having an evolutionary history, we would argue that modern humans were created de novo through God's direct personal intervention, uniquely to bear his image, and that modern humans, again, did not have an evolutionary origin, but were the products of God's divine handiwork, and that the biological similarities that we see, whether it's anatomical, physiological, or genetic, with not only the great apes, but also with the other hominins, including Neanderthals, reflects common design, not common descent, where we would point out that in the Genesis 2:7 and Genesis 2:19 passages, it tells us that both Adam as well as the animals were made from the dust of the earth, which implies shared biological features to me, that there should be biological similarities between humans and other creatures. But that note in Genesis 2:7, humans receive the divine breath, whereas the animals don't. And this difference, we would argue, suggests that the primary difference between modern humans and other creatures corresponds to the presence in humans of the image of God and the absence of the image of God in other creatures. And we would include Neanderthals in that, where we would say Neanderthals were intelligent, emotionally capable creatures, but yet they were still cognitively inferior to humans. They lacked something that we have as humans, and that difference would be essentially the image of God. And we think the image of God manifests as the advanced cognitive capabilities that modern humans display. So from our perspective, we would argue that Neanderthals would be biologically and behaviorally distinct from modern humans, that Neanderthals must indeed be a distinct species from modern humans, but that there would be shared features, but those shared features reflect, again, common design, not common descent. Now, in the first edition of Who Was Adam, we predicted, based on how we understood Neanderthals, that the Neanderthals and modern humans would not have been able to interbreed and produce viable offspring. That was a prediction that we made in the first edition of Who Was Adam. We since then have recognized that that was a failed prediction, and that we have revised our model to include modern human interbreeding with not only Neanderthals, but as with Denisovans as well. And our model would even accommodate interbreeding with African people groups and a yet to be determined hominin, if indeed the evidence takes us there. Now, for a number of years, I was highly resistant to the evidence for Human-Neanderthal interbreeding. And when Who Was Adam was published as the first edition, there was no evidence whatsoever for Human-Neanderthal interbreeding. No compelling evidence whatsoever. And that evidence really resulted when the very first Neanderthal genomes were sequenced, and those genomes were then compared to the genomes of modern humans. And that was the first point in time where we saw evidence that looked as if indeed modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. Initially, that evidence was statistical, that looked at essentially a closer sequence similarity between the genomes of Neanderthals and European and Asian peoples compared to African peoples. And one way to explain that closer statistical association is through essentially an interbreeding event or an intergression event that introduced Neanderthal DNA into the human genome, with the estimates being somewhere between 2 to 4%. I didn't find those initial claims to be that compelling, but I now am of the opinion that indeed there was interbreeding that took place. And so one of the questions I oftentimes get is this: did Neanderthals and modern humans actually indeed interbreed? And my response now is I'm somewhere about 80 to 90% certain that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. And part of the reason for that is because of studies like the one that we're talking about. I know of no other way to explain the fact that from person to person, while we may have, again, 2% Neanderthal DNA in our genome, how you would account for the fact that we have different Neanderthal sequences that comprise that 2%. The only way, to me, that makes any sense is that there were multiple intergression events between modern humans and Neanderthals. I know of no other way to explain that. And it's pretty impressive to me that, again, you could reconstruct almost 50% of the Neanderthal genome from Neanderthal DNA sequences in the human genome. And so, or at least in populations of human genomes. So that's really rather impressive to me. On top of that, there's other data where people have discovered Neanderthal DNA in anatomically modern humans, where the remains date at about 40,000 years in age. And there you actually see a much higher percentage contribution of Neanderthal DNA in those modern human genomes, which is what you would expect because this is closer to the time where the intergression took place. And the fragment sizes for the Neanderthal DNA sequences in those genomes is much larger than what we see today in contemporary modern human genomes, where now the average fragment size looks to be about, again, 575 base pairs in size versus fragment sizes that were much larger and much more contiguous. So to me, the only way to make sense of that data, if we're honest, is indeed interbreeding took place. And so this is why I have to acknowledge that the data for interbreeding actually, again, represents a failed prediction of the human origins model from RTB. And we've actually revised our model, and that revised model appears in the updated, expanded version of Who Was Adam, where we have an entire chapter devoted to modern human Neanderthal interbreeding, where I survey all of the work done in this area up to the point where the book was published, that, again, I think presents a reasoned case for interbreeding between humans and, or check that, modern humans and Neanderthals. So then, if that interbreeding really took place, does that now mean that the biblical view of human origins is invalid? And in fact, many people would argue that again, this evidence for interbreeding provides very compelling evidence for integration. That provides very compelling evidence, for common descent. The evidence for integration provides compelling evidence for common descent. And again, the argument would be that if modern humans and Neanderthals came from the same ancestral group, they would have been able to interbreed. And as that group gave rise to two lineages, one culminating with Neanderthals, one culminating with modern humans, that over time, those isolated populations would become less and less able to interbreed to the point where they would eventually reach the point where they would become essentially genetically isolated population groups, where they would become distinct species. So the fact that we're able to see interbreeding suggests that that modern humans and Neanderthals must have come from a shared population and must have a shared evolutionary history. And yet I would argue that while that is not, again, unreasonable, and that's how the evolutionary paradigm would view the data for integration, with regard to the RTB model, we would argue that again, you could argue that the shared biological features that we see between modern humans and Neanderthals is due to common design, not common descent. And it's interesting to note that there isn't any Neanderthal DNA, at least to my knowledge, found in the Y chromosome, in the human male sex chromosome, which means that that the Neanderthal modern human hybrids that were male would either be non-viable or would be non-fertile, would be sterile individuals, which highlights the fact that these two were actually distinct groups, and that you could argue that they were indeed distinct species that were able to interbreed because of the fact that of the shared designs or the common designs, but that they were just on the cusp of being able to interbreed and produce viable offspring. And it turns out too that analyzing the Neanderthal DNA contributions to the human genome, and then also analyzing Neanderthal genomes indicates that Neanderthals were, again, relatively small populations where there was a high level of introgression within that population, but that the hybrids that resulted were on the cusp, again, of health, that they were on the cusp of good health, that they were compromised individuals, that they were they were not healthy, robust individuals. And so this all contributes to the case that they were indeed distinct species, and that you could understand them, again, as being distinct creations by God, where the capacity for interbreeding was due to the shared design that we see, not due to a shared evolutionary history. Now, young Earth creationists would argue that they must have been the same species if they were able to interbreed, because isn't the definition of a species the capacity to interbreed and produce viable offspring? Well, that is the one definition of species. That's the biological species concept. But there are numerous examples of distinct species that can actually interbreed and produce offspring, and that those hybrids that are produced are actually robust and fertile offspring. And so just because organisms belong to distinct species doesn't mean that they can't reproduce and produce hybrids that are not only healthy, but are also fertile as well, that they in turn can produce their own offspring. And the fact of the matter is there's other data that suggests that Neanderthals and humans were, again, distinct species. This includes the anatomical distinctives, as well as, and most particularly, the distinctives between the modern human brain and the Neanderthal brain. There are also behavioral differences that we can infer from differences in the brain structures of modern humans and Neanderthals, as well as from the archaeological record that indicates that modern humans were cognitively superior to Neanderthals. And then on top of that, we know that Neanderthals and modern humans displayed different developmental trajectories, that their development was very different. And so these are all arguing for, again, the fact that Neanderthals and modern humans are indeed biologically distinct. And even looking at the differences between Neanderthals, the Neanderthal genomes and the human genomes identifies a number of differences that involve gene regulation and even the structure of genes that play a role in neural development and in cognition, where it's clear that neurologically and cognitively humans and Neanderthals were indeed genetically distinct. So I think all of this actually supports the RTB prediction that modern humans and Neanderthals would be biologically and behaviorally distinct. And you could argue that, again, the capacity for interbreeding reflects common design, not common descent. So while it does create some measure of discomfort for the RTB human origins model, it doesn't necessarily undermine that model. Okay, now other questions are much more theological and biblical in orientation. And when it comes to this idea of God allowing interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals, where many people are uncomfortable with that idea, why would God allow that interbreeding to take place? Well, I mean, it is evident from, for example, passages like Genesis 6, that in early human prehistory, there were interbreeding events that were taking place with modern humans and another group of human or human-like creatures, and that God was displeased with those interbreeding events. And so just because we question why God would allow that, there seem to be biblical clues that suggest that our capacity to interbreed with other groups of either humans or other groups of human-like creatures, depending upon how you interpret that very difficult passage of Scripture, there does seem to be scriptural warrant for believing that humans would have interbred with other creatures. And I think it also is significant when you go to Genesis 2, where Adam is naming the animals, because through this process of naming the animals, Adam is studying these creatures in order to give them an appropriate name. He is really functioning as the first zoologist there, characterizing these animals where their name reflected their nature, their character. But through this process, he recognizes that none are suitable for him, that none bear the image of God, that none are suitable mates for him. And this is when Eve is created in the biblical creation account, and as being one who is a suitable helpmate for Adam, one who is like Adam, not only biologically, but also is like Adam in terms of bearing the image of God. But you get a sense from reading this passage of Scripture that there would have been a temptation on Adam's part to seek out a helpmate from these animals because they, again, were biologically similar to Adam. And so God is having Adam go through a process of discovery so that he learns why it is that none of these animals are indeed suitable for him before God gives him a helpmate. And it's also interesting that you see prohibitions in the Levitical law against bestiality. And when you factor in human depravity, it's not that hard to believe that humans would have been engaged in interbreeding events, particularly if there were creatures that were close enough to us in terms of their physical appearance, creatures like Neanderthals or Denisovans, that there would have been a temptation for those kind of interbreeding events to take place in light of, again, human depravity. We also are making an assumption, too, that it was modern humans that initiated these integration events. Could it be that Neanderthals were the ones that initiated the integration events, or the Denisovans, and it wasn't compliance on the part of modern humans, but they were actually forced into these interbreeding events where you can envision Neanderthal males or Denisovan males forcing themselves on modern human females. And so again, it may not even be questions of depravity or questions of seeking after mates outside of the biblical bounds that God put in place, outside the bounds that God put in place. So in other words, there are some biblical clues here that suggest that interbreeding isn't necessarily incompatible with the biblical view of human origin in early human prehistory. Now, the other question on the table is this. What about the hybrids? Would the hybrids have a soul? Would the hybrids bear the image of God? And this, again, is a really interesting theological question, and I'm not sure that there's a lot in Scripture to guide us on this. My sense is that whether you take a creationist view for ensoulment or a traducian view for ensoulment, where the creationist view is that God creates the soul, the image of God, in each human embryo at the time of conception or at some point after conception, or you take a traducian view where the image of God in our soul is transmitted to offspring through a type of spiritual inheritance, just like our genetic makeup is transmitted from both parents through genetic mechanisms, through biological mechanisms, that there is a spiritual inheritance as well that we get, where our soul is made up of an amalgam of the soul of both of our parents. Whether you take either of these two views for ensoulment and for the transmission of the image of God from parent to child, you could argue that in a creationist model, that God would have honored the fact that this hybrid was partially human and would have introduced the image of God into that hybrid. Or if you take a traducian view, you could argue, well, is the image of God actually divisible? Can you have half of an image of God? Either you have all of the image of God or you have no image of God. And so by virtue of the fact that it's not, the image of God wouldn't be divisible, you could argue that the hybrid, even if one of the parents was a modern human and bore the image of God, that the hybrid, that the offspring would have the image of God as well. And I think it's important to note, based on this current study, that the Neanderthal contribution to the human genome had no biological consequence. It did not impact any of our traits or our properties that we would consider that make us human, if you will, that account for our humanness. And in fact, people have discovered that within the human genome, there are these regions that are called Neanderthal deserts, where there's absolutely no Neanderthal DNA in certain regions of the genome. And the assumption is that in these regions of the genome, natural selection would have prevented Neanderthal DNA from being incorporated into those genomic regions because it would have had a harmful deleterious effect. And there are other studies that suggest that these Neanderthal deserts correspond to genes that play a role, again, in our neurological and cognitive development. And so when you put that together, it looks as if that God indeed maybe didn't create humans to prevent interbreeding with Neanderthals, but did put in place protective mechanisms. So if that interbreeding did take place, it wouldn't compromise our identity as human beings and our identity as image bearers. Now, this idea of human Neanderthal, or I should say modern human Neanderthal interbreeding and interbreeding between modern humans and Denisovans and modern humans and maybe other hominins to be determined is clearly messy stuff. It clearly makes a mess of things, to be certain. But it doesn't mean that it necessarily invalidates the biblical account of human origins or the biblical view of human identity and human nature. Again, though it's messy, I think that the biblical text has clues that suggest that this interbreeding likely indeed was very much part of our early prehistory, and it was part of our propensity, particularly after the fall, to seek out mates that were outside the bounds of what God intended, and that even in the midst of what we intended for evil, or what for others intended for evil, that God could have somehow intervened and worked it for good, as God is often wont to do. And one other point that I'm going to make is, and that is this, that the intergressions that we see between the modern humans and Neanderthals, modern humans and Denisovans, modern humans in Africa, and again, yet to be identified hominin, actually contribute to the genetic diversity of humans at the point of our origin and at the point that we migrated around the world. And this can actually help us to respond to the claim that there's no way that humanity could emanate from a primordial pair, from an Adam and an Eve, as two individuals that would have given rise to humanity, because the genetic diversity among the human population groups today is too great, too extensive to come from two individuals. But if you incorporate intergression events into human prehistory at the time of shortly after the time of our origin, and even at the time of our migration around the world, that this actually contributes to genetic diversity and may be a part of the solution to this claim that the genetic diversity of humanity is too great to come from two individuals. These intergression events actually help support the biblical view that indeed there were two individuals that gave rise to all humanity. Okay, enough about modern human Neanderthal interbreeding. I'm going to go ahead and bring this broadcast to a close. I would be very curious to see what you think about the question of modern human Neanderthal interbreeding in the comment section. Also, please take a moment to check in, say hi, let me know who you are, where you're watching from, and also please feel free to suggest topics for future episodes or pose questions for future episodes. If you want to dig deeper into the question of modern human Neanderthal interbreeding and see a much more systematic, coherent presentation of our model for human origins and our view of the hominins relative to modern humans, and how we handle the whole question of Neanderthal modern human interbreeding, I would commend to you the expanded, updated edition of Who Was Adam that you can get either through Amazon or through our website at reasons.org. Until next time, I'm going to leave you with this thought that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless each and every one of you. I pray that you stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in good spirits. Until next time,